Hi, my name is Zach Presley, and today I'm going to tell you about the history of the St. Louis Cardinals. Cardinals are the most successful team in the history of the National League, and they have a huge tradition of success and continue to do so. I'm going to tell you all about how the Redbirds, all the way from the inaugural season, the first season, 1892, all the way up to this last season, 2012, and the beginning of this season, 2013. I'm extremely qualified to talk about the Cardinals because I've been a fan of them since before I can remember. My first T-shirt was a Cardinal shirt, first shirt I ever wore. I've seen almost every game I could ever get my hands on. I've been to a ton of games, and I live and breathe St. Louis Cardinal baseball. So I'm going to be telling you about the early days of the franchise, the glory days. Even the hard times that they went through when they first started out, and all the big players that were on the team, and how they're continuing the success that they had today. So let's talk baseball. Let's dig right into this. The early days of the franchise, their first season was 1892. They were originally called the St. Louis Brown Stockings. And they finished second to last in their first season. It wasn't a very good first season. Just a few years later, they changed their name to the St. Louis Browns. They just took off the stockings part and shortened it down. Then in 1899, they changed their name to the Perfectos, which only lasted about a year. Then a female fan said to a reporter when they were called the Perfectos, what a lovely shade of cardinal the uniforms are that the Cardinals wore. And the reporter put that in his article, and the name just kind of stuck. So they've always been known as the Cardinals ever since then. And I'm kind of glad that they named them that. So their first 20 or 30 years, the Cardinals were not that good a team. I'm just going to be honest with you. They only had a winning record 5 times out of probably 30 seasons. So they were a pretty bad team most years. They finished dead last or next to last 16 out of their first 30 years. They just went through a lot of changes in their first part of their franchise, and they just weren't that good. But they continued to push forward, and the next year Cardinals baseball was a lot more exciting. We're going to talk about the glory days here. The first part that got real good was the 20s. The Redbirds won their first World Series in 1926 against the New York Yankees with good old Babe Ruth, who didn't come through for the Yankees because the Cardinals beat them that year. In the 20s, the Cardinals had one of the greatest ball players of all time. In my opinion, the greatest second baseman of all time. Rogers Hornsby, the great Raha is what they call him. After the 20s, in the 30s, they were called the Gas House Gang because they were real hard-nosed, gritty, do whatever they have to do to win, and they were kind of show-offy, but they were a good ball club in the 30s. They won 2 more World Series titles to add on to their first one that they won back in the 20s. The next decade, in the 40s, this is probably their most successful decade of the whole franchise. They won 3 World Series championships that year. They had a lot of great players. They had a lot of good players starting out in their careers. They had guys like Stan Musial and Red Shangeast and Joey Medwick and those kind of guys. There was a lot of really good players on that team in the 40s. The 50s wasn't much to talk about. They didn't do a whole lot then. They had some good players, but they didn't really do much as far as winning World Series. And the 60s, they had another great decade, almost as good as the 40s. They had some really good players that year, those years too, like Lou Brock and Bob Gibson. Bob Gibson was probably one of the greatest pitchers of all time, and Lou Brock was the stolen base king until Rickey Henderson broke the record about 10 years ago. They won 2 more World Series titles in the 60s, and they started to become known as just a force to be reckoned with in the National League, and they just started racking up the World Series titles, and no one wanted to face them because they were a hard team to beat. They carried this success into the modern era. In the 80s, they were a really good team in the 80s too. They were a lot different than they used to be. In the 60s and the 40s, they were a pretty big power team, but in the 80s, they kind of ditched that and were more of a speed team. And they kind of went back to how they were in the 30s, where they were hard-nosed and just did whatever they could to win. They had a kind of baseball that people called Whitey ball, after the name of the manager, Whitey Herzog. He was focused on just getting runners on and moving them over and getting them in any way they could. He wanted them to steal bases and that kind of thing. They won another World Series title in the 80s, and they are also in two more that they lost. The 90s, not a whole. They didn't win that much as far as World Series titles, but they won a lot of baseball games, and they had someone I'm sure most people know about, Mark McGwire, who had a pretty big story in the late 90s trying to beat the home run record for a single season, which he did that. Then in the 2000s, they started to bring back their winning ways, and they won their first World Series title in 22 years in 2006. That was a pretty good year. I remember that year. I was pretty happy then. Then again in 2011, they won another World Series title, and they also appeared in one in 2004, and this last year, 2012. They lost both of those, but no big deal. They'll go again. They look to have a great team this year, and try to get their 12th World Series title, because they just got their 11th in 2011. In the history of the Cardinals, they've had some really good players. I told you about some of them. So they have over 10 players in the Hall of Fame. Really, they have like 15, I think. They have more than almost every team in baseball other than the Yankees and I think maybe the Giants. They've had some players, I mentioned most of them, but they also had guys like Ozzie Smith, who is known for his defense and doing cartwheels and stuff. And lately they've had guys like Yadier Molina and Albert Pujols. They just continue their tradition of success and just keep bringing up players that are going to help get championships. And they just have a really good team right now. I'm hoping for a good year this year. So in summary, I've told you guys about all the history of the Cardinals, all the way up from the early days, the glory days, all the way up to now, all their players, all their good players, their star ones. The Cardinals have always been and continue to be the class of the National League. No team comes close to their 11 World Series titles. The closest one, I think, is the Giants with maybe 8 or 9, but the Cardinals just have a lot more than most teams. And they just keep on winning like they've always done. They're just the best team out there. So that's the Cardinals. Thanks for watching, guys.